Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us on our last full session of the season. I'm your host from Western Sustainability Exchange, Adele Stenson, and we're recording this session so it'll be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. So don't say anything that you wouldn't want your mama to hear. And if everyone, it looks like everybody is on mute, so that's great. Thanks very much. Because WSE strives to connect ranchers with income options that help them on their journey with regeneration. One of those options is a carbon market. And there are several companies that are working in Montana currently. And to me, it's like trying to choose health insurance. It's really hard to compare apples to apples, and there's these little nuances that make it confusing. And then, of course, there's just your gut feeling of who you want to work with, who you connect with, and what feels right. So that part is all on you, but hopefully our presentation tonight will help you sort through some of those nuances. And then throughout the presentation, you'll be able to ask questions, and you can either do that through the chat or you can just unmute yourself and ask questions when there's a chance. So our hope is that tonight will give you a good foundation in carbon markets so that you can make an informed decision about whether that's even something that fits your operation, and if it is, what direction you might want to go in pursuing that. Tonight, we'd like to welcome Kevin Hackett, and he's going to educate us about what carbon markets are, how they work, what buyers look for, and what ranchers need to know. He's Native's Vice President of Market Strategy and Engagement, and he's been with Native since 2007. And he's developed a strong sense of the carbon market and its trends and trajectory over that time. In his role, Kevin is responsible for understanding the current carbon market landscape and anticipating its future evolutions in order to align market needs with Native's portfolio strategy and investment decisions. So full disclosure, I think most of you know that WSE works closely with Native, but this evening is not meant to promote Native's program, but rather to utilize their 2 decades of experience in this market to discuss the complicated arena of the carbon markets in general. So we appreciate the fact that Kevin is willing to share his in-depth knowledge of all things carbon market related so that landowners can be better prepared to complete their own due diligence in this very young industry. Like I said, we're going to run tonight's session as a question and answer. So I'll lead off with a set of questions, and after each of Kevin's responses, you'll have an opportunity to ask follow-up questions. And then, of course, there's always time at the end to ask questions as well. So without further ado, we're going to get started. First of all, welcome, Kevin, and thank you so much for visiting with us tonight, and especially since it's, 9 p.m. for you right now?
It is a little past my bedtime already, but we'll get it done here.
Hope you got a chance to hit the caffeine today. So first off, can you explain as simply as possible how the voluntary carbon market works?
Sure. Maybe the easiest way to go about this is to think about what the goal of the voluntary carbon market is, and that gives us a sense for what it is and how it operates. The voluntary carbon market was ideated and established as a way to create a mechanism where entities, buyers, could voluntarily provide funding for activities that reduce, remove, or avoid carbon emissions. And it was really setting up a mechanism to enable that dynamic to occur, where you've got buyers or potential project funders on one side, and they've got a desire to reduce emissions. And they're looking for opportunities to provide funding in order to make those carbon reductions happen. Their motivations for doing so could be altruistic. They could be looking to substantiate a claim. They could have targets that they're trying to achieve. They could want to support a particular region, technology, activity, a group of people, etc., that they want to use their carbon funding to unlock and to support that particular set. But at the end of the day, what they're looking to do is to provide that funding somewhere in the world where it can unlock additional carbon reduction activities that aren't currently happening. It is a voluntary market. and meaning that there's no government or legal requirement for anybody to participate. So the entities that are supporting, in the case of most of the grasslands work in Montana, is being supported by voluntary actors that are doing things for the reasons I mentioned before. It could be altruistic, they could be substantiating a claim, they could be wanting to support a particular activity like grazing because they're connected to the product, the region, whatever it might be. But it is voluntary, and although they might have a need to substantiate a claim, ultimately they can decide not to participate in the VCM, voluntary carbon market, at any time. The activities that are part of the voluntary carbon market are the projects that we're talking about in this case: improved grazing practices in Montana. That would be the project activity, and those would fall under the activities of the carbon market. They also include lots of other project activities, everything from reducing or destroying methane at something like a landfill gas, or reforestation, planting trees, avoiding deforestation. There's a whole host of different project activities that could be used to reduce or remove carbon that are part of the voluntary carbon market. But all of those are structured in a way that entities, and like I was mentioning before, can support, can provide funding, can catalyze those activities to happen, and then claim the results, the carbon reductions or removals that happen as a result of those projects.
And what we're going to focus on tonight is strictly the grasslands projects, right?
Correct.
All right, thank you. So when they do this, if I enter into a carbon contract, what am I actually selling? If you say you're selling carbon credits, what does that mean?
Yeah, in this case, landowners that are participating in this type of carbon project, they're ultimately being paid for the outcome of the actions that they're taking, in this case, changing grazing practices. Those grazing practices can result in increased amounts of carbon being sequestered into the soil. Those increased amounts of soil carbon can be quantified in terms of tons of CO2 or tons of CO2 equivalent. Those activities and that resulting outcome, those reductions of carbon emissions, can create a carbon credit. And ultimately, that credit is an asset that can be bought and sold by other entities out there, those funders that I was mentioning in the early question, those buyers that wanted to claim the result of those actions. They want to claim those carbon credits. And so ultimately, that's what's being transacted at the end of the day, is somebody's buying those carbon credits that are being generated, those assets that are being created by the result of improved grazing. Really, what is also happening in the case of lots of these programs is, in order for those outcomes to happen, funding needs to be provided to pay for fencing, for water resources, for increased management time and energy going into that. There's a trade-off. You're being paid for those things to help produce the asset, the carbon credit. That's ultimately what's valued in the market, and that's what companies or buyers are wanting to purchase.
So you're not actually selling a right on your land so much. It's not like a water right or a mineral right or anything like
That's
that.
correct. It's not similar to a land right or a water, something like that. The voluntary carbon market has no claim or ownership on your actual land or water or resources. What the voluntary carbon market in this case is looking for is to make sure that you're taking on an activity, in this case, improved grazing. That activity is resulting in more carbon being sequestered in the soil. We can quantify that volume of carbon that's being sequestered and account for that. And that quantification, that asset that's created there in terms of tons of CO2 sequestered in the soil, that's ultimately what's being transacted on. But there's no additional ownership or claim on lands or water resources, anything like that.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. So the next one is when people talk about the carbon market, they talk a lot about credits being or projects being validated and then verification. Can you clarify what that is? What's the difference between those two things?
Sure. When we talk about the voluntary carbon market, we're really talking about this global landscape of carbon reduction projects and the rules and frameworks under which those projects are developed, so that they're palatable for the vast majority of the participants in the voluntary carbon market to be able to have confidence that they can source the carbon credits that are being generated and know that each of those carbon credits is generated according to a particular standard, that they're following rules and frameworks to quantify them. In term that comes up is validation. When I say carbon standards out there, people may have heard or be familiar with Vera or American Carbon Registry, potentially Gold Standard, Climate Action Reserve. Those are some of the standards that are out there. Those are the sort of the housings for the protocols and methodologies of the carbon market. In the case of, in particular, the work that we have in Montana, we use Vera as the standard for that project. I think there's a number of other projects and project developers using the same or similar standard under Vera. What Vera does and what the other center entities provide is a set of protocols that are approved. Those protocols are frameworks, they're all the rules for how a project needs to be originated and developed, how it needs to be measured and quantified over time. It's the playbook for how to develop and implement a carbon project. And so they have this large book of rules, protocols for how to develop a project. And what happens is a developer will look at that whole menu of potential protocols, and they'll pick one of those and say, this is the playbook that I want to follow for developing my project. They'll work with, in this case, ranchers to develop and implement a project according to that rules framework. And then what has to happen in order for the market to be confident that this project is following those rules is we need a third party to come out and validate our project activity against that rule framework. And so what they'll do is they'll look at the rule framework, they'll go through it step by step. They'll look at the project and they'll make sure that the project is adhering to those rules and those protocols. And at the end of the day, if everything goes according to plan, at the end of the day, at the end of several months or even years, if everything goes according to plan, they can sign off and provide third-party validation that your project is in fact following those protocols. At that point, Vera will take that third party's view and say, yes, we see that they've adequately looked at this project activity. They've matched it up and say that it follows the rules and it's achieved validation. And at that point, the project activity is a valid carbon project underneath the standard, in this case, Vera. At that point, your project is an active participant in the voluntary carbon market. It is able to then go forward and start generating bona fide carbon credits according to that framework underneath Vera. And so then the project activity occurs. And so in this case, ranchers will work to implement the improved grazing plans that have been developed as part of the program. They'll implement those for a period of time. After that period's up, say a year, maybe 2 or 3 years, depending on how the project is being rolled out, we've got to then go and check the performance of that project and understand how did it operate and what was the resulting impact. In this case, we're trying to determine how much carbon was sequestered in the soil over the period of time that project activity was taking place. And what we do is we go back to that rules framework that was originally used for validation. We use that as the guidebook for helping us quantify the change in carbon over time. We'll look at the baseline activities on the ranch and probably a lot of the stuff that Tara's working with folks on, others from other carbon developers. All of that information about historic practices, baseline soil organic carbon content, the changes that have been implemented, the grazing records for that period of time, all of those are then put into a model accompanied with actual soil samples that are taken. And we can quantify the change in carbon over time. Again, using a third party to come in and check all of that work and ensure that, yes, in fact, the activity took place, it took place as it should, it followed the rules framework. And at the end of the day, that third party can then verify the performance of your project over that period of time. And at that point, you'll have a verified carbon credit that can be issued. That is then what the market wants to transact on. That's what they want to buy and purchase and put funding forward for.
So just a real quick, simple process.
It's just something you can do on the side.
Yeah, exactly. So if a carbon development company is actually working with landowners Can you assume that their project has been validated?
No, no, not necessarily. And a couple things to dig into there. The broader voluntary carbon market, the majority of headlines that you might see or announcements from Microsoft or whoever the large carbon buyers might be, most of what they're interested in is and willing to support and confident in is projects that have gone through this process of third party validation according to a standard and third party verification of its performance over time. That's what the vast majority of the market is interested in. It's not to say that there aren't some sort of entities out there who are willing to put money into activities that don't have that validation or verification. And it's not to say that those approaches are wrong. Certainly, everybody has their purview and willing to do those things. But if we're talking about the vast majority of the market, it's around these validated and verified projects. And then, no, it's not always the case that a developer that you might be talking to you right out of the gate has a project activity that's fully validated and ready to proceed. There could be, as you say, it's a quick, simple process. They could be at the very beginning of those things. If we go back in time to when we started working, when Native started working in Montana with our project instance there, that was at a time where we didn't have a validated project. We were just at the beginning. And so it does take time to work through that process. Just because an entity has or doesn't have validation achieved yet doesn't mean that it's not headed towards being a reputable and great project. It's just potentially earlier in the process. It could be more risk because that hasn't been achieved yet. And there's no guarantee that they'll actually make it that far. Validation, as you joked, it's just a simple, easy thing. It is an arduous process. It is quite in depth. It can take quite a substantial amount of time, in some cases, a year or more to go through that, especially if a developer is new and not familiar to the workings of a carbon project and the carbon market and the third-party entities that are involved, and in this case, Vera as a standard. So there's increased risk the earlier and earlier that a developer is in those activities. It's not to say that's bad necessarily. It's just a different risk profile than being able to potentially engage with a project that's already achieved that particular milestone.
All right, that makes sense. You already answered my next question. Let's see. The next one is, can you provide some insights on the variability and fluctuations in market pricing for carbon credits? Like in these grassland projects, I'm thinking about in regard to the companies that are buying from the developers. Like, why are they willing to pay different prices?
Sure. I think oftentimes people see or think of a carbon credit, it's reducing or removing 1 ton of CO2 of carbon, and want to be able to make the distinction that it's the same fungible commodity that another activity that's reducing 1 ton of carbon, or even from potentially the same region, same project activity, same project type. But the reality is that's just not necessarily the case in the eyes of the buyers and funders that are out there. And if we attempt, or I attempt, to draw a parallel between sort of the carbon market and my very rudimentary understanding of beef and cattle market, and you can all correct me where I go astray here, but let me take a shot at this. If we look at supporters of a project, like a project activity or grazing project in Montana, we're talking about a single thing. You could have select high-end buyers that really value the quality of a project. They have a high willingness to pay. They recognize a tight connection between the price that they're willing to pay and the producer needs. And they value things like supporting directly the community, directly in particular, you could point to specific ranchers that they're working with. They see a connection between the long-term stability of this project activity and their ability to provide funding to make that happen, potentially equivalent to selling meat to a high-end restaurant or retailer that wants a top quality product. If you could think about potentially some of the meat coming off of your ranchers going to that type of buyer, you're able to justify and achieve a premium price. But then you've also got other cattle on your property that could be going to a slightly lower class of buyer. They could be particularly engaged buyer, maybe somebody that's participating buying at a farmer's market, something like that, where they want a direct connection, they're willing to pay a premium. Maybe they're not buying at a super large volume, but they're willing to pay a relatively high price for carbon or for beef. The next step below that, you've got maybe a general market buyer where it's an average price, decent to larger volume, similar to maybe a product like certified Angus beef or country natural beef, that examples that were given me to some by somebody else as opposed to me knowing those things. And then still sourcing from the same project activity, or in your case, ranch. You could also have some large volume, low price buyers that are potentially buying product for themselves, potentially buying for resale. They're probably buying at large volumes. If you were to think about those being in parallel to the exact same things that we deal with in the carbon market, coming out of the same project activity, you have buyers that value things differently and see things differently, and some are willing to pay a high premium to maybe be involved early to support different aspects of things, where the majority of the market winds up being somewhere in the sort of mid-range. But just to give you a sense for why there could potentially be variation in price, and why you might hear a whole range of different price levels at different volumes and different sort of connections to project activities.
All right. So along those same lines, it seems like there's also, in talking with different people that have talked to different carbon development companies, seems like there's a fairly wide range of what is being offered to ranchers from those companies. And it would seem like you would have very similar costs. I know that all of the companies have substantial upfront costs, but do you have any thoughts on why there would be such a difference there and what's actually being offered to the rancher?
Yeah, at the end of the day, costs from relatively similar project activities are probably pretty close in terms of the funding that's needed to make these activities happen. Where we start to see the variability in pricing that's being offered really comes down to the view that a developer has, and how they're developing their individual business, what their philosophy and approach is, and what their overall strategy is, and then what their view is for where demand and pricing are going to be. This is a voluntary market that can fluctuate, it can move up and down based on all sorts of external factors. And so when you think about a developer and how they're trying to develop their business and what their view is, it's driven by a few things: their perspective and their approach. If you look at pricing and what they're able to offer, developers are looking forward. They're looking to understand where pricing is going to be in the next 5, 10, or 20 years. No one has a crystal ball. There's lots of different forecasts and views. There's different assessments on where demand is going to be. All of those have variability in them. And at the end of the day, it's the developer that's putting their view out there of saying, no, we're real bullish on price. We think in 5, 10, and 20 years, we're going to see massive increases in price. And we're confident that's going to happen. And because of that, we're willing to offer a higher price to get ranchers involved, to get them signed up to build our quote inventory, so that as these prices grow, we're able to take advantage of them, and they have that aggressive stance. Love to see that happen. I think we'd all be quite happy if we saw massive increases in the price of carbon over the next 5, 10, 20 plus years. But the reality is we just don't know. And there's risk involved. There's lots of fluctuation. In my tenure, we've seen it quite a bit. And so the other approach is being more conservative. You have developers out there that have a different view, that yes, they see the potential for increased pricing and demand in the future, and are in this business, at least in part, because they recognize that there is that opportunity at some level out there, and are hoping to achieve some version of that in the future, but have a different strategy and approach for how they're going about developing their business. They're taking a more conservative approach. They're building for the right now, and they're building for creating a stable base. Ideally, they are putting mechanisms in place that if some of those increases in demand and pricing happen over time, that the participants can share in those. The view on in that particular case is more conservative, and it's really the it comes down to the philosophy of the developer and the business that's creating that particular project, and pulling it together in a way that they best think the market is going to respond over the next decades. And you've also got to potentially consider funding sources that are behind some of these entities and what their overall view is, and how they're pushing a developer to act or behave, or pushing their view of how they should structure a project based on ultimately what their end game is. Are they looking to amass a whole bunch of contracted acres that they can flip and sell to some other funder or entity out there? Those are all sort of possible scenarios. Again, I don't want to give too many non-answers. It's not to say that any of these things are right or wrong. They are just different approaches for how a business might develop its carbon project and bring it to market, and how that best aligns with the views of the ranches that are participating.
So that kind of comes back to that whole gut feeling thing of, if you're more risk averse, you might want to go with a more conservative company, versus if you're more into have that confidence and want to take a little greater risk, you might go the other way.
That's correct. I mean, I'm assuming it's not too dissimilar from lots of the other dynamics that are evaluated in everybody's day-to-day working lives. And yes, it does come down to a hard look at each individual ranch's situation, what their risk tolerance is, what stakes they're willing to put out there for different levels of benefit, and then ultimately how that aligns with where your operation is going for the next several decades.
All right. So along those lines, so if you were to contract with a carbon developer, and somewhere down the line, whether they couldn't sell the credits or something went wrong in that contract, what is a rancher's recourse at that point? So say they've contracted, they've done some things, they're a few years into the project. If that contract falls apart and they're no longer contracted with that company, then can they just go to a different company and start a new carbon project with them?
Yeah. So by engaging in a carbon project, part of what you're doing is you're setting a baseline for your activities. And we're saying that by now being engaged in this, you are implementing improved grazing practices. Your baseline now becomes implementing those improved grazing practices. And so by going ahead and enrolling in a program and participating in those improved grazing activities and participating in the carbon project, you essentially engaged in that activity. And should something change, you decide, I don't like this developer, the developer goes belly up, or whatever the situation might be, the abilities that you then have at that point to re-enroll in someone else's carbon program can be quite limited, because at that point you've already taken on those activities, have already begun the process of improving your grazing activities. To then say that I'm going to enroll in somebody else's, and you're going to basically negate the fact that I ever began this process in the first place somewhere else, and enroll in someone else's program, is against the rules frameworks for carbon projects, because those activities are already occurring, because you're already doing those things. To enroll in someone else's program and say, oh no, I haven't begun those things, I'm not doing those, if I join your program I'll start. That's the exact opposite of what the carbon market is looking for. The carbon market is looking to support instances where those activities aren't already occurring, and by starting them and engaging in a program, you've started down that path of doing those things. And yeah, that would fly in the face of the rules frameworks, and that third party validator that we were discussing earlier would take issue with it. It's not to say that there might be an extreme case where you could make the case that if I can't enroll in this new carbon program, I'm going to till up all my land and that's my only choice. maybe there's some extreme case there, but by and large, once you've started down the path, you've begun, and re-beginning isn't, or starting over isn't really a path.
Okay, so you better get it right if you're gonna do it. Um,
Correct. And get right on your view of the developer that you're working with, because ultimately you're in partnership with them and their approach and the way that they're bringing your project to market.
all right. So the last thing that I have is, what are some of the top things that you think a landowner should ask a carbon developer? All of this so far keeps coming back to, it's a one-shot deal if you decide to do it. The company that you choose is the company you're with. And so what are some of the things that we should know as far as what questions to ask those folks?
Yeah. I'd love to be able to give you three gotcha questions that you ask these three things, you get yes or no answers, and at the end of the day, you then have your formula for how to make your decision. Yeah, as we all know, that's just not likely the case. But what you do want to know are things like the developer that you're engaging with. What's their past experience in carbon? How have they engaged in carbon projects in the past? What's their experience in getting things from ideation and those initial conversations with you at your kitchen table or the hood of the truck as they're sort of pitching you their ideas? You want to know, yeah, have they been successful in doing this before in other places with other project activities or project types? Have they gone through this process yet? You want to know what their strategy is going forward. You want to understand how they're going to sell the credits that are associated with your project activity, who is their market, what ability they have to confidently sell those into the future, what's their track record for doing so in the past, and what's their approach to doing that in the future. You want to understand how they see the market going in the future. You want to know what they think of the risks and opportunities that are out there and how they're positioning their business vis-a-vis those risks and opportunities. You want to be able to assess, is this a high risk, high reward situation? And does it align with your sense of where price and demand might be going? And does it align with your risk tolerance as an operator? You want to see what their business plan is out 5, 10, 20 is probably a bit guesswork, but you want your best understanding of how they're going to approach the market and be able to elicit as much as you can from them to be confident that they're the right partner for you and how you see your operation interacting with carbon going forward.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. Does anybody want to chime in with your own questions? Because we've exhausted my initial questions. So we'll open the floor. Dan Sanders, go ahead.
All right. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
A few different questions, but I'll start with this one. A lot of the regen experts will say that a operating system should be cycling carbon, not storing it. How does that translate to, if you are cycling carbon, are we still storing carbon in the ground and able to get credits? Or I guess just looking for your views on that point. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we brought backup on this particular question as well.
That's good.
Yeah.
Always good to have backup.
He's talking to you, Caitlin. Or Tara, either one.
I'm not sure I have a great answer for that one. It's a very good question. The idea is to get more carbon into the system and into the soil and reduce losses long term. And the grasslands are a significant sink of carbon, and trying to hold it there where it can support soil function over the long term is the goal. I'm not sure I can speak entirely clearly to your question, or if you could elaborate on it a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, I guess I'm just again, the John Camps, those type guys will say we should be cycling carbon, and it's a cycle. The plant is taking it in, it's using it, it's got its exu dates, and I speak greatly to it. I'm just curious of if
I
that is
see what you're
really
saying.
happening. Is that good for if you're trying to sell carbon, or are you better to do other practices? And so I guess I'll add to that question is, have you guys seen best practices that are producing the best results for getting the carbon credits.
To speak to what you're saying about the cycling, the cattle are a really critical part of that. So the grazing rather, I shouldn't say cattle, the grazing is cycling that carbon. So it's continuing to move through the system as that energy moves through the system through the grazing process. So that's where the cycle comes in that I think is really critical. And it is very hard to have these healthy systems if there is not grazing used as a tool in that way. Maybe that would be the piece of the cycling that is important we can't leave out.
Okay, good. So is that the best practices that you're seeing, is just making sure that there's a grazing component to it?
Yeah, and I might let somebody else jump in on this as well, but if we're talking about a grazing system versus a farming system-based system, for example, where you're looking at reducing tillage, increasing diversity and using cover crops, or carbon-based amendments like compost or manure would be one system, and then the other system would be a grazing-based system where we're basically trying to increase photosynthesis, increase plant growth, then increase the amount of forage available to cattle, the quality of the forage that goes through the cattle, gets cycled through the system and continues to keep those minerals and the energy cycling through the system instead of becoming more stagnant. And the other piece that's really important, of course, is the bare soil and erosion, the loss through erosion. So can we keep more carbon cycling through the system with more photosynthesis and more energy cycling through the animals and the plants, and at the same time reduce any loss that would come from, particularly from erosion due to bare soil? That would be my take on that, but I'm not sure if somebody else would have something else to add.
Tara, would you want to speak just a little bit to the recovery and rotation piece of that? I think most people are pretty familiar with that, but I think that's a basis to most of the grassland carbon programs that I'm aware of.
Yeah, this kind of the structure of these grassland programs are on the basis of, like Adele just said, an increase in rest and recovery, which also translates into a greater rotation of a livestock herd, and also trying to, with moving those animals, condensing them a bit. And the kind of how you do that and how you accomplish that, to what extent, there's a few different variables in there, but that's the basic house structure of, that's what the methodology has been created and adapted to, with basically the grazing science behind that, and how to predict those carbon stores and those permanent carbon stores, kind of referencing what you had mentioned earlier. There's a level of cycling in the soil, but that the soil science that's being used in these programs is based off of permanent soil carbon stores in the soil, so a bit deeper. And yeah, and based off of those practices, then we're able to predict and eventually even see that greater life and carbon in the soil. Hopefully we all answered your different pieces of your question, but if we missed anything, just let us know and we can tackle those pieces.
That was great.
Thanks for the question.
All right, for some reason I am not seeing oh, wait a minute, now my chats are up. Sorry, I was missing all you guys in the chat. Okay, we have a question from Kathleen. Can the original company you sign with sell the contract? So if you sign with one developer, can they sell that contract to somebody else? That's a great question.
Yes, depending on how your individual contracts are structured, and certainly on a case-by-case basis, there's not a standard contract that every developer is using. So it is something to review with your lawyers and your folks. But from a carbon project standpoint, there would be nothing that precluded a developer from selling the full contracts and the full project to another entity. That wouldn't cause it to fail as a carbon project. What's in your individual contracts or contracts that you're reviewing from a different developer may or may not enable them to do that just in your relationship with them. But from a carbon project standpoint, and from the standpoint of Vera as the example, it wouldn't preclude the project from continuing if that happened.
So very important that you read your contract carefully and that you can live with those terms regardless of who owns that contract, right?
Correct.
Okay, so the next one is Tatum asks, does a carbon credit program benefit ranchers who have already started the planned grazing process?
Depends. And Sarah, you can chime in here if I'm getting too much into your area, but it depends on when those activities started and to what extent they have started vis-a-vis the carbon project. Some of the rules, frameworks, and protocols have a look back period where they'll go back a couple of years, and depending on how extensive those changes in grazing practices have been, may or may not be able to continue on as a carbon project or precluded from participating. Generally speaking, if those activities are relatively new and were done with the view that there's carbon benefit that's likely to accrue here, and done with the view that there's a carbon market that's out there that's going to value the activities that I'm taking on, those have a path to be included in a carbon project. If this is an instance where somebody started those practices years or decades ago and is fully in the sort of regenerative rotational grazing space and is implementing those project activities, and was doing so without any view that there was going to be a carbon market to value them, that typically would preclude them from being able to participate in the program.
Wanted to add that I think maybe one other piece of that is whether you are brand new to these improved grazing practices or whether you've started, one really vital piece of these projects is something called additionality. In simple terms, basically what that means is these projects are meant to help catalyze change on acres that are part of the project. And if some ranches who have started but maybe wouldn't have that additionality piece where there's not more change either that they can or would like to make, that can sometimes make them ineligible for projects. But then usually, and particularly I think now with some of the newer methodologies that are coming out, it's definitely, there's more and more acreage is able to be included in these types of projects. So I would recommend, if you're really not sure, definitely engaging with different companies to find out, do these things make me ineligible? Is it just certain acres where maybe one pasture wouldn't be the best fit, but my other pastures would? And I encourage everyone to have those conversations to really figure out where their acreage stands.
So like everything, it's not cut and dried, apparently. Okay, thank you for clarifying that, both of you. Bo Comble asks, are the contracts recorded at the courthouse? And if so, do they show up on title policies? And how would that affect the appraised value of the land? So I think he's basically asking, is it a cloud on the title if it's recorded at the courthouse?
That one I don't have, but
I can take this one. And also, for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Tara, and I am the manager of the Northern Great Plains Improved Grazing Program in Montana for Native. And so I work really closely with Adele and all the folks at WSC. And I work on the project side. So I work with the ranchers to help see if this program is a good fit for them and guide them through that process. Whereas Kevin, after we've done the work on the project side, he deals a lot with the other end of the carbon spectrum where those credits are then going to the voluntary carbon market. So just, I guess, maybe if that helps with anyone's questions or who is answering what, that's why sometimes I'll answer one and maybe Kevin will answer a different one. But good question, Bo. The answer to that is not super cut and dry, but basically the methodology requires something called a public notice of wanting to be involved in one of these programs. And I guess the short answer to your question is that they don't have to be recorded at the courthouse, but that is one avenue that Native has taken for that kind of public notice. But there's other options as well. We have a very witty founder of our company who's also our lawyer, and he made a joke a few months ago, but it was dead serious. He said he could even make a Facebook post about it. So just saying that and saying that there's different options, but one way that you can make that public notice is by filing something called a landowner declaration at your county clerk's office. And from what I understand, they do show up on the title policy. Now, how that affects the appraised value of the land, that's actually something that I don't think I can answer because we haven't had a ranch sell with that on the title. We would assume that it would help the appraisal because if you are taking on a project like this and choosing to continue it, if you're, say, buying a piece of land, that is involved in a project like this, that is a lot of increased kind of revenue from a project like this. So we would think it would help that, but that's not something that I know for sure. And that's why we keep that door open for if anyone's not wanting to do that, that they have other options.
And so I would assume that again, that comes back to read your contract very carefully and know whether or not you're creating a cloud on your tile, correct?
Exactly.
Okay, got another one here. How can these programs affect potential land use? For example, hunting leases, wind farms, solar farms. So basically, I think he's asking, are you limiting your other options?
Yeah. A carbon project like this is primarily concerned with getting carbon into the soil and keeping it there. The getting carbon into the soil, I think we've covered how that happens, improved grazing processes, changes in photosynthesis, and bringing more of that carbon into the soil. We want to encourage that to happen as much as possible. We also then want to ensure that carbon is going to stay in that soil and locked up in that soil for as long as possible. And to do that, we want to make sure that the soil isn't really disturbed. It continues to be grassland and grazing land and continues to have these activities occurring on them that aren't risking something happening where that soil is remarkably disturbed and that carbon is released back in the atmosphere. So something like hunting on the property, that's not really going to affect carbon in the soil. We need to make sure that we have control over that property and control over the ability to make sure that carbon stays in the soil. So depending on what a lease would look like, and what control and ability you've got to maintain that carbon into the soil and into the future, that would be something to consider and look at. I think there was mention of wind farms and solar going on property, that those changes in land use and potential disturbance of soil, those are the types of activities that risk releasing carbon from soil in the future. Activities like that, although solar or wind are potentially environmentally beneficial things, we could risk the overall project activity and could risk reversals of that carbon that's being stored.
So if somebody thought that they were wanting to do something like that, they might want to say, I'm going to set these acres aside and not put them in your project. And then they could do that, correct?
That's correct.
If they wanted to do a development type project. Okay.
And I would add in there too that some of these examples, even with my last question and with this one, that's specific to natives program as well. So I don't want to speak on other programs if they're allowed to just take out certain acreage.
Again, comes down to your contract. Okay, I've got another question from Bo. Are there other programs that you recommend stacking this program with, such as Grassland CRP, CSP, Equip, the Sustainable Ranching Program through WWF? Can you stack with some of those to help with your improvements?
Hunt the terror on that one.
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, there are other programs. A lot of those programs that you mentioned, Bo, are programs that are very aligned with our goals. And it's actually seen as a benefit for our particular program if you're working with other programs in order to reach these kind of improved grazing goals. It shows more long-term commitment. And we have several ranches that are contracted that work with all of those groups. I think the biggest thing with carbon now being a bit more of a common subject, a little bit more of a hot button issue, we do see some programs now that are popping up that try to claim certain climate benefits, which can sometimes interfere with the claims of a carbon credit, because one thing about carbon credits that's really important is that you cannot double claim them. And so that's something that Native tracks to make sure that doesn't happen. Really, any legitimate carbon company would. It's good if you're working with those programs to double check with your carbon developer to make sure that there's nothing clashing. But those ones that you mentioned, Bo, up to this point have been great partners in helping the infrastructure and the planning of some of these really great grazing projects.
Thank you, Tara. And Caitlin put a link in the chat that also, I'm assuming, helps explain the whole carbon cycling deal. Is that correct, Caitlin?
Yeah, it was just building on what Tara brought up, a good point, which is we're looking at different carbon pools, and the goal of a program like this is to get as much carbon stored in your deeper storage carbon pools and less in what's cycling and faster in over seasons or a couple of years. And so a lot of that is based on soil microbial activity and root exudates and the carbon that the roots are putting into the soil. And then as it continues to cycle and gets complex with the minerals, it becomes part of the deep storage pool. So for those who are more interested in that, there's a little reading there. I'll be happy to visit more with folks as well.
Thank you. So it's not an either or is what you're saying. It's a both.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Dan Sanders has a question. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, do you see any further expansion into other similar things? So it's related to Bo's question a little bit, but ecosystem services was I've heard it called as far as like water quality or habitat. Is there any future expansion into those type of additional stacking opportunities, or is it going to be just carbon for the near term as far as you're aware?
Sarah, you want that one or?
I'll take half of that one, and then maybe you can talk about what on the market side of that and fill in my gaps. So the thought of stacking carbon programs or something more like an ecosystem service, like biodiversity credits, water credits, there's a lot of rabbit holes we can go down. I think the first thing is that a lot of these programs require a lot of tracking. And like have been talking about tonight, the different companies may have different ways of going about tracking data or the level to which they track data. And so when we're thinking about, are these different programs going to be able to stack? Like we keep saying, it does, I think, depend. Especially it would be more possible if you're working with the same company and they're developing more of these programs together, because there's like maybe a cleaner line in between tracking all of this data and making sure those credits don't get double counted, particularly when it comes to carbon. And then as far as the ecosystem services go, and actually beyond Kevin, this might be something that Adele or Holly can chime in on, because I know WSC is starting to work on this ecosystem service kind of area of the organization to see how viable it is to have a biodiversity credit or a water credit on top of these programs, because we see that as something that's extremely valuable. But I think it's in the stage where we're figuring out how do you track that? How do you quantify that? How is that data collected to show a change? And then basically what would you award that? And I'll let Kevin take over from here. From what I've heard is there is definitely a hunger from the market for that, but still companies want to invest their money into things that are solid. And so as that's solidifying, there's more and more eyes on it, but I don't think it's still pretty fresh and new. Kevin, hopefully I'm correct in what I said. I'll let you take from there.
Yeah, you're spot on there. There is some interest out there in biodiversity credits or water benefit certificates, things of those nature that can be stacked onto a project activity like this, where you could potentially be generating multiple streams of assets and benefits that could be sold to different entities out there that are looking to purchase or to put funding into those activities. I will say that those markets and those types of assets are relatively new and nascent and overall where their markets are at. I think we're interested in seeing those things mature and come along as they potentially provide additional funding sources and revenue streams, similar to the different funding sources you or someone else was pointing out earlier, that can help to accelerate these practices. And if we can stack multiple streams of benefit onto these things, it's a good way to bring more revenue in and to accelerate the process of getting more and more acres enrolled. We'd be excited for it to happen. It's just, it's nascent and starting to grow here at the moment.
Can I add something in here, Adele? Okay. We always tell people who are looking into carbon programs to make sure that in their contract, they are not giving away their ecosystem services, because there is opportunity to make more revenue off of them. That said, up until a couple months ago, most ecosystem service programs were tied to carbon. So if you were in a carbon program, you could not double sell your carbon credits into an ecosystem service program. But there is opportunity, and I think it's just going to get more and more widespread, and we are learning way more about it right now, but there is more opportunity to have ecosystem service revenue be generated on your ranch that is not tied to carbon as an outcome. And so I guess my recommendation here would just to be make sure that you read your contract again, like Adele's been saying, and do not give away those ecosystem services.
Thanks, Holly. That was a good add in there. Do we have any more questions, or did I miss anybody in the chat? If I did, just speak up. You don't even have to raise your hand.
I asked a question about wildfires. I said, how does native or other carbon credit programs handle wildfires? For example, your ranch is scorched after you signed up, or your ranch is scorched now. Is it a better time to sign up in the world of carbon cycling?
Oh, thank you, Tatum. I'm sorry I missed that one. Thanks for
Sorry.
speaking up.
So maybe I'll start with the part around you enroll in a program and then your ranch is scorched, and what does that look like? This question comes up a lot in the market in relation to forestry related projects for obvious reasons. And in those cases, particularly the carbon market is interested and concerned about those because most of the carbon that we'd be interested in is above ground biomass in those cases. It's in the trees that are being planted or growing over time. And so if a wildfire was to occur there, you'd have potentially massive reversals in that carbon being stored in that the fire came through and released all that carbon into the atmosphere. At an individual project level, there's mechanisms in place within the voluntary carbon market to absorb those catastrophic losses. There's buffer pools that are set aside for just that situation that is potentially a reality that can happen. There's mechanisms to ensure that an individual landowner or someone isn't penalized for that happening, and carbon credits can be replaced out of these insurance pools that are set aside to mitigate the risk of that causing someone hardship or negating claims that a buyer was making, something along those lines. In the case of grazing project, the carbon that we're most concerned with is below the surface, down in the soil. And the risk of a wildfire coming through and wiping out the carbon that's stored in the soil, the risk profile there is vastly different. There's certainly still risk of catastrophic change there and other risks, that potential land use changes or some coming in and tilling up the land or going into development because of some series of events that occurred. Those are risks that are out there for releasing carbon from the soil in a soil carbon project. I will say that when we as developers, and probably most other developers, are looking at a project, we're looking at the risk of those things happening and what the likelihood is of those things happening, and in doing calculations and quantifications are taking those risks into account and building in the appropriate insurance mechanisms and buffer mechanisms to be able to absorb some portion of the portfolio or portion of the project having something happen to it. We're looking at these projects over long time horizons, 40 years. And so being able to account for those risks and adequately build those into our quantification forecasting for the production are important. And again, at the standard level, there's insurance pools there to help to deal with those risks as well.
Thank you. Tara, I know we've discussed this just recently. Do you want to take on how eligible somebody might be if they've had a fire recently and want to get in the program?
Yeah, I was just thinking that, Adele. So great question, Tatum. So I guess your question about, is it a good time to sign up now? In the world of carbon cycling, it's not going to necessarily matter whether you're signing up, whether you just had a fire or you didn't, because it actually, the funny thing about the modeling of carbon is it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily matter where you're starting off from. What matters is your improvement from where you're starting off from. But I think the really great part about maybe starting off, if you just had a large fire, is that you are restarting your system. And so you have the opportunity to really relook at where fencing was, where water could be or was, or different changes that you could make, which I would then say is a really great opportunity to use the tools of carbon funding to improve your grazing system. And you basically, Mother Nature paid for some of your demo work. I would say in that sense, it is a really great time to do it. But I think one interesting topic that comes up when we're speaking to ranches about when is a good or bad time to sign up, is my land, is it better in a dry year or is it better after XYZ? And it's the calculations aren't super dependent on that, I guess, is one of my thoughts on that. But yeah, if you just had a fire come through, I would say it's a good time to reach out to a company.
Thank you, Tara. Anybody else?
All right,
Oh,
last one.
All right.
Does a native still have a minimum number of acres, and do you expect it to go down as your acquisition costs hopefully go down per property? Thank you.
Yes, good question, Dan. We do still have a minimum acreage of about 2,500 grazable acres, but I know I do encourage anyone maybe who's under that to reach out to me, let me know you're interested, let me know what those grazable acres might be, and I'm happy to keep you informed on when we might be interested in going in under acreage, because there is, like you said, Dan, understandably, there's lots of costs that go into these projects. And so as these projects are getting their feet under them, the smaller ranches that really cost very similar amount to the larger ones. And so to kind of keep the project alive, we put that minimum in there, but there are a lot of variables that would make us look at some smaller acreages. So yeah, I would say don't be afraid to reach out and get on our radar so that we can stay in touch about that. As we're potentially wrapping up some questions, any other project questions, or I know a lot of people just have really specific eligibility questions, and my email is always open, my phone's always open. I'm happy to discuss any of those with anyone, whether you are seriously interested in the project or just wanting to gather your information, since this topic may be coming across your desk often. I not only believe, but Native really believes that education is a really important piece in just finding a good fit for your operation. And I'm always willing to share that knowledge. And then I, of course, know Kevin and anyone at WSC is.
Thanks, Tara. I'll put your email, and if it's all right with Kevin, I'll put his too in the show notes. So once we get this up on our website and on the YouTube channel, then that information will be there. And then Tara's also put it in the chat.
Yeah, certainly happy to provide with any insights we can.
That's awesome. Thank you. Okay. At the moment, I'm not seeing any more questions.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, you certainly may.
Thank you. So speaking specifically to Native, how long are your contracts? You may have already mentioned this and I missed it. And then also specifically with Native, but also with other carbon programs, are contracts negotiable? Meaning if there's something specific that my family and I are concerned about or would like to put into a contract, are there negotiables and are there sample contracts?
Another great question. So part one answer, Native's contracts are 40 years. And this actually ties in really well to what Kevin was talking about earlier in this session, where you have different maybe companies having different approaches to how they set up their program. And underneath a methodology, which any legitimate carbon company is aiming to be validated by the methodology, verified to that methodology. There's a few different ones like Kevin had mentioned, but our legitimate carbon company would be either have completed that or is striving to do that. Under the methodology that Native is under, which is a VERA methodology, they require these projects to be 40 years long, basically. And I'm happy to go into the details if you're interested, but basically comes down to wanting to make sure that carbon is stored in the soil permanently. It's not being cycled, because if the carbon is too surface level, then like we were talking about with Dan's question, might cycle. But then also for that buyer confidence to know that when they're purchasing that credit, that is going to stay there. And so that's the reasoning behind that 40 years. And so when speaking to Native's program, Native has decided to make sure that the operations that would like to be a part of our program, for all intents and purposes, they sign on, they want to make a long-term change and want to do that 40 years, because Native, being in the business, believes that it's a smart choice to make sure that in 20 years, maybe with a shorter contract, we're not bumping up against any issues that could maybe make those buyers back off and think, oh, this program won't complete to the 40 years and therefore might lose some of those certifications. And again, like Kevin said, everyone has a different maybe approach to it. But if we're talking about our program, that's a little bit of why Native has chosen to just stick with the 40 years. But that's a methodology requirement, which then goes into the second part of your question on contract negotiation, where you're going to have two buckets of things that could be negotiable or things that could not be negotiable. So the things that probably wouldn't be negotiable is anything that the program is needing to keep in order to reach that verification or validation. If it's something that the methodology is stating, then it's not really necessarily up to the company. It's not really up to Native. If they want to keep that status, they maybe have to adhere to those principles. But then there's a lot of things in a contract that is obviously like an internal company decision on how they're running their program. And speaking for Native's contract, we tend to keep our contracts as similar as possible for everybody, because we don't want to have there be a difference of really negotiating power for someone to say crack a better deal. But Native's very committed to having contracts that our ranchers are comfortable with. And that actually was a big piece of when Native created the program with WSC, is how do we create a contract that protects the rancher, but then also gives them access to the carbon market. And there are many pieces of it that are negotiable in a sense of wording or maybe added assurances or things like that.
And then I think Tatum had also asked if there are samples. Is that something that companies do or that might be available somewhere?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. Samples, like soil samples?
Like samples of contracts?
No, I don't, to my knowledge, and Kevin, you can, if you know of any, you can correct me. I don't know of any sample contracts. That is something that is, I think, like a very unique kind of special sauce to every company. And so they tend to keep those pretty close to the chest. But I do know that for our program, once we establish the eligibility of a ranch, we do give them the opportunity to look over the contract early in the process so that we can have those discussions on, are we comfortable with anything? Are there any negotiations or conversations we need to have that we can adjust to make it more comfortable? And so if we continue to move forward, that everybody's on the same page and happy to move forward. I'm not sure how the other programs, how they handle their contracts, but I think you'd have to probably be engaged with a company in order to see a contract, would be my guess on that.
Thank you. Did that answer your question all the way, Tatum?
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
You bet. All right. In regards to this topic, last year at our Expanding Markets conference, we had 5 of the main carbon companies that are working in Montana. And we had a panel and we got to put all of them, including Tara, in the hot seat. And they answered a whole series of questions. And we put all of that down on paper and it is available on our website. And if you want to see the carbon market comparisons or carbon company comparisons, you can access that on our website too. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes also. I think that I can let Holly take it away for a few minutes before we sign off. Go, Holly. You've been waiting for this all day. Come on.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I actually put the link to the carbon site in the chat. And if you just scroll down, there will be a PDF that you can open up and look through for all those 5 carbon companies. I just want to briefly explain a couple of opportunities that we have for supply chain or just some monetary. We have actually, let me back up. There's a company from Minnesota that is looking for cull cows, and the payment is probably going to be roughly about 10% over what you're going to get through the ring. They will pay the trucking to Minnesota, and you get paid on the hot carcass weight. And this is a company that is AGA certified, American Grass Fed certification, and or Audubon, but they do have some leeway. And as long as the ranch can prove that these animals are grass fed and no antibiotics through their, I'm assuming life, maybe not life, like in the last so many years, then it's not a problem to sell into this market. And so please, if anybody has any, we're going to probably start putting loads together here in the next week or so. And so it'll all be on region. Wherever we get the most interest is where we'll start trying to get a truck out to and load those cattle. So that's one. The other opportunity is in June, oh man, did I just lose hang on. June 24th through the 26th in Helena this year, we are hosting KLR Sell By Marketing School. This is a company from Australia, and they have learned from the best. So they learned from Bud Williams, and they have taken this process and they have developed their own system and added to it and have been doing it for 20 some odd years. And they are going to be in Montana for actually the United States for the very last time from Australia. And so we are lucky to be able to host them in Helena, June 24th to the 26th. And if you are interested at all in the sell by idea, they claim that you can do this with cow-calf pairs. It doesn't have to just be yearlings or other class of livestock. And it's a 2.5 pretty intensive workshop, and you come away with about a 300-page manual, which I like to see everybody read front to back. But yeah, so they give you a lot of the tools to take home with you and how to start doing this market where you're being able to capitalize on the markets that are hot at the moment, like I said, and or just through your cow calves. So I encourage everybody to look into that, and you can just contact me and I can get you information. We don't really have anything on our website for it. So yeah, that's all I had, Adele. But if anybody has any questions on either of those two, please reach out to me.
Yeah, and does anybody have questions right now while she's here and you've got her? Right. I think the one piece maybe you missed, Holly, was that if you are part of World Wildlife Fund's RSVP program, this is one of the
Yes.
classes that's eligible for a scholarship for that.
Absolutely. Thanks for that.
Betcha. So with that, I think there's lots of great workshops coming up this summer. So I'm hoping to see some of you at those, and watch your newsletter. It'll be out here in the next couple of weeks. Lots of opportunities this summer for really good workshops, a lot of them out in the field from WSE and EMRA and a whole slew of people that are putting on really good opportunities for us this summer. This will be, as I said before, our last bull session of this spring. We'll start up again in the fall, probably November, maybe October. But if you have any ideas for topics that you'd like us to cover, please feel free to just shoot us a message, and we would love to have some ideas, because we want to do the things that are pertinent for you guys. If nobody has anything else, I want to especially thank Tara and Kevin, everybody who participated tonight and asked questions, and may your calving, kidding, and lambing, etc. go smoothly and your grass grow tall. Good night.